Holy City Center Radio is episode 147, and I am your host, Christian Sanger. Today is Monday, July 17th, 2023. It's Monday, and today we are asking, what's my age again? That's right. As I mentioned on the last podcast, I went up to Charlotte on Friday to see Blink 182 and had a great time. I saw on social media after that there were several other people from the area that went, so that was kind of surprising to see other people had made the trip. But yeah, I had a really good time. They're one of my favorite bands. I've been listening to them since high school. So it was when the tour was announced, and the fact that Tom, one of the co-founders and lead singers of the band, was coming back after being away for a few years. I had to go see them, and it bought tickets during the pre-sale in Charlotte, and was excited to find out that one of my friends and her husband were going to make the trip as well. So was glad to know that even though I ended up not going with anyone myself, I would at least be able to hang out with them for a little bit. It didn't quite go that way because unfortunately I didn't get up there until close to the show start time. So I only think I had about half an hour from when I got to the hotel until the show started. There was two opening bands and I didn't miss anything. So it wasn't a big deal. But because of that, my visitation time with my friend and her husband and what turned out some of their friends as well. I didn't realize this at the time. It was like a birthday celebration weekend. And so they were making a whole weekend out of it. So I didn't get much time with them, but that's okay. It was still cool to make the trip. The hotel I was in was very nice. The area of Charlotte I was in, I'd never stayed in before. Previously, I've been up to Charlotte. I've seen shows at the amphitheater that's out there. And this show was actually like in the heart of the city at where the Charlotte Hornets play of the NBA. And anytime I had stayed in Charlotte, which usually I would just drive home after, I would see a concert at the amphitheater, or if I went to like a Panthers game, I would just drive home after the game. But the couple of times I did stay, they were usually like a little bit on the outskirts of the city proper. So I wasn't like in the heart of the city and what was going on. Not that I really was. I mean, I was in that area this time and didn't really do anything besides the show. But it made me be like, oh, okay, this is the part of Charlotte that I don't usually see when I come up here. And it was kind of cool. There was, it looked like there was a lot of restaurants and other things in town that you could do, whether that, was like a museum or something, but also just fun things walking on the road, some different architecture, art, and there were street performers and things like that. It was a Friday evening, so I'm sure that's not an all the time situation, but it just was a little bit more livelier than I was expecting, and maybe want to go back to Charlotte, maybe for like a long weekend or something and spend some more time and actually like see what the city has to offer, because I've never really done that. But in any event, I got there pretty close to showtime. Didn't get to spend much time in the hotel, which seemed really nice. And I know you're not supposed to do that on vacations, but or trips or whatever, spend the time in the hotel. But it's kind of fun if you hang out in a new city to just chill out in the hotel for a little bit and just enjoy a nice room or whatever else they may have. But got over to the arena. It was pretty crowded and long lines for merch and food and drinks and things. But I wasn't there to pick up any merch or get any food or drinks, so I didn't have to really worry about that. I went and spent a lot of time like in the concourse level as the show was getting started. I wasn't super interested in the opening band, so I didn't really spend a lot of time in the arena itself until I needed to. It was just texting friends, saying like, hey, this reminds me of, that time in college we went to the show at this place, or hey, remember when we used to sing these songs together in the car? And, it's, they were a band that I got into, I think maybe like my sophomore or junior year of high school. And it just became like one of those bands that you just become like super into pretty quickly. And it was that time frame where they were, one of the biggest bands in the world. They had these hit albums that came out. They were all over MTV when they were still doing TRL. They were one of those few bands that weren't like a boy band or, like a Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera type that like dominated that time on TRL and award shows and reality shows even on the network. And, there were a few rock bands that kind of crossed over to mainstream success and could actually take the place of some of those other acts. As I've gotten older, I have more of appreciation for some of the acts that when I was like in high school and college, I was like, oh, it's not cool to like those. And, I'm supposed to rag on them or whatever. So I have more appreciation for them. But at the time, it was fun to have a band that I felt like was, popular. I mean, because they're certainly like more pop punk than like a traditional punk outfit. And it was cool. And it was on the grand scheme of things in the weird high school world and college world, they were popular, but it was okay to like them type of thing. And so anytime a band that I liked crossed over, that I felt like it was okay to like, which is a whole silly thing. We don't really need to dive into all that. And all my friends seemed to like them. My friends who like the same type of music as me normally, as well as, some of my friends who maybe were into the types of music I wasn't really into, but we could meet and all enjoy this band. And so I have a lot of memories involving the band and their music, not just going to shows and seeing them, but like I said, when you were driving around in your car or a friend's car, going to wherever, or just hanging out in a dorm room or someone's home, just listening to music. I even have distinct memories of singing the songs during high school sports practices with some of my friends. Because again, the albums were big and they were everywhere. And there was a live album that came out where there was a lot of banter between Mark and Tom, the lead singers. And we would repeat those dumb jokes and laugh with each other. And when the songs would play, it was just crazy. We would just be silly kids just having fun. And it's like a warm feeling hearing some of those songs. And for the most part, their music is just kind of silly and fun. There are some more that are a little bit more serious, but it was just a fun group to listen to and share with your friends. And so it was really cool to go and see them live again for the first time in a long time. See the people in the crowd that were just as excited, if not more so, and just being it's always fun when you go to a show like that where everyone feels like they're really into the band, or at least open to, yes, this is going to be a fun time. And it was a blast. Even though wasn't sitting with my friends during the show itself, and they had much better seats than I did. It was still really cool to relive some of those songs, hear the new one that they released earlier this year, and it was just a blast. And again, even though I'm talking a lot about nostalgia, it was a good show in its own right. This wasn't, I've seen bands over these last few years that I never got to see when I was younger, that I've kind of just gone just to say I've seen them, or just like, hey, I wonder what they're like. They seem really fun and cool, or I really like this song, but I've been to some shows where they play like the two songs I know, and the rest of the show is kind of like ugh, you can, you can definitely take it or leave it type thing. This is not one of those. This was fun in and of itself, although nostalgia played a big part in my enjoyment. And they had pyrotechnics and fun stuff going on during the show, including their drummer Travis Barker being lifted above the stage for a handful of songs. It wasn't as crazy as they've done in the past, where he's like playing the drums upside down in the air as he's spinning around, but still doing that shtick was enjoyable to see. And of course, their banter wasn't as much as it used to be, but still a little bit, just telling dumb jokes and being goofy, and it was just a good time. After the show, I tried to meet up with my friends. They were at a bar. Well, actually, it ended up being two bars, and I couldn't find either of them. I think both were like set back from the main road. So even though I was on my GPS, like trying to meet up with them, they'd be like, "You're here," and I'm like, "I don't see this bar anywhere." And I think it was because it was like an alley of. I don't know. For whatever reason, it was really, really difficult to navigate in a city I did not know. And so unfortunately didn't get to spend time with my friends, like I said, like I would have liked to. Went back to the hotel, basically crashed right away because it was kind of late at that point, 11 o'clock era to midnight. And, I'm an old man. So, and then I woke up, got ready in the morning, and got back to Charleston, so very quick trip, but definitely makes me want to go back to Charlotte to spend some more time there, because it just seemed like a kind of a cool place to be, and had some fun. So not much else happened this weekend. Got back, did some work, relaxed, and that was the highlight for sure. But it was even though the last 2 days of the weekend, Saturday and Sunday, were involved driving and doing work and not really being social or anything, it's okay, because Friday was something out of the ordinary and a lot of fun. So I had a blast. And if you were some of the folks that made the trip up there, I'm sure you had a good time as well. But enough about me. Let's get into the news. So this is a update to a story I've talked about a lot, but specifically an update about an editorial the Post and Courier ran that I talked about recently. It involved the South Carolina's, so-called Freedom Caucus, that fringe group far right fringe group that we have in our state house that have tried to pass some of the worst legislation we've seen in modern times anyway. And the Post and Courier did a story about how that group has sued some school districts, claiming, and they're using all those buzzwords like CRT and wokeness, and that kids are being indoctrinated when it comes to issues regarding race, gender, and politics. And one of the schools decided to settle the lawsuit, and it gave off the impression that they were in the wrong, the Freedom Caucus was right, and their accusations about racist concepts or whatever being taught in schools was true, when in actuality the school chose to settle because they decided that going through with the court case and spending money just wasn't in their best interest, and also because settling meant nothing. It just meant it ended. They didn't have to pay anything. There was no fines. There was obviously no jail time or anything like that. They didn't even have to admit wrongdoing. It's basically like this lawsuit just didn't happen. But of course, the Freedom Caucus would spin that as a win for them. See, we were right. They settled, even though they didn't admit any wrongdoing. And in this day and age of social media where people don't read beyond the headlines, it looks like a win. And that Freedom Caucus, for all their faults, are good about drumming up anger and fright among their base and, some others who may not support this extreme caucus in many ways. There's some stuff that they agree with. And there's a big part of the Republican Party or conservatives or people who, if not identifying as a Republican themselves, but tend to vote for that party, would see this stuff and believe it. And why wouldn't they? The people that they support and believe are doing things in the best interests for their community are telling them that schools are doing these horrific things and they're teaching stuff that you wouldn't support. So, of course, when they see a headline like that and they don't read past it, they think that this group is doing the right thing. And yes, all of our kids here in South Carolina are being indoctrinated. So the article was an editorial piece, but it was all about when they looked into this lawsuit that the accusations weren't even true. And on top of that, there really weren't any like actual details in the lawsuit. It was just like a broad accusation. And so they kind of called out the Freedom Caucus in this editorial, saying this is just like a nuisance lawsuit. It's meant to drum up support because, again, without reading past the headline, you just see that lawmakers are suing a school because they're teaching kids things they shouldn't. And a lot of people just believe it and didn't look into it any further or didn't follow up with the case when it ended. And so that's what it was about. Well, apparently, after that was sent out, a lawyer for the Freedom Caucus contacted the Post and Courier, specifically the folks behind this editorial, saying that, hey, you left out some of the most egregious examples of what was happening in schools, and you're misleading your readers by not doing that. And that's what this update is about. So up until this point, Post and Courier says out of all these wild accusations they've seen about schools, the closest one they've seen that has come to being true was a story where a teacher instructed students to dress in black to mourn the election of Donald Trump back in 2016. And that happened at a private school, not even a public school. That's the closest they've found to these accusations of racism being taught or any other buzzwords, like wokeness, critical race theory that are misunderstood and misused all the time. That was the closest they found to it. Now, there have been other examples where teachers have kind of gone rogue, for lack of a better term, and maybe assigned something or said something when they were talking off the cuff that they shouldn't have. And the Post and Courier found that those were usually dealt with, those situations, up to and including termination. Teachers were fired. One such example was an assignment that encouraged students to click on an adult website to learn more about a society of gay men. Obviously, not the best idea. Don't send kids to an adult website, even if your intentions were good. That's not the way to go. So, but those were all one-off examples. There's not a ton of them. It was not part of the official school curriculum. It's not like the school was like, yes, that's right, teach that, do that. It was, again, just like a teacher doing something on their own and making mistakes or just doing something they shouldn't have. And that's really been it. And it's not a widespread problem by any stretch of the imagination. But over the last 2 years, we've been hit over the head with headlines nationwide and here locally about how schools are teaching all these things and these buzzwords are being thrown out. And there really hasn't been any substance to any of these accusations. No school so far has been found to have violated any state law. There's been a state law for generations saying schools can't teach racist concepts. So this isn't even a new thing. Although the legislature passed like a temporary law outlawing what they call indoctrination, which okay, but because of this, they filed those lawsuits I've mentioned before. And it's becoming increasingly clear what was really the point of these lawsuits. These things aren't actually true. It's just innuendo and, big leaps in logic to grab headlines and anger people, especially people who want reasons to be angry. And it's working, and it has worked. So the Post and Courier's put out some editorials basically saying this is all bogus. This isn't really what they're saying it is, et cetera, et cetera. I talked about them on the podcast. And then, as I mentioned, one of the lawyers for the Freedom Caucus reached out to the Post and Courier and was pushing back on their assertion that the schools didn't actually violate any of the law and that they didn't provide any evidence. The lawyer suggested that perhaps the writers of this editorial hadn't actually read the lawsuits and that they were that was like at best, and at worst he was alleging that they were hiding the worst examples from their readers by leaving things out, and said that their allegations were true, that they were violating the law. So the Post and Courier says, yeah, it's true that they didn't use any of the examples that the lawyer was alleging were in the lawsuit, and that's because they weren't in the lawsuit. It turns out when the lawsuit was originally filed, these things were not in there. It wasn't until after that initial round of editorials about the lack of substantive allegations and after the Charleston School District actually filed a motion asking the court to just dismiss the lawsuit for that exact reason and some others, that the caucus finally filed what's called an amended lawsuit, and this happened back in April. Amended lawsuit basically just means something has been filed, a lawsuit, of course, and there's some new details that are going to be added to it. Either they're being added because the lawsuit was flawed to begin with, and they really needed some more examples or any examples to actually consider this lawsuit to move forward. Or, sometimes there's situations where a lawsuit is filed and then something happens after it's filed that needs to be added. Like, hey, this is continuing, and here are some examples. So those examples weren't added until after all these editorials and things ran. So the editorial board said that there were some pretty unsettling accusations that were included in this amended lawsuit. But of course, after looking into these examples and saying, oh, maybe Post and Courier had it wrong, granted, they didn't know about these accusations when they initially wrote some of these editorials because this was added later. But if these are true, this changes everything. Well, of course, they weren't true. So it didn't matter. Post and Courier, again, I'm using the name because it's the entity, but obviously it's the editorial board, and even that, it's probably not all of them. So, just so you are aware, this isn't like this huge project that the entire organization undertook, but those accusations were looked into, and the Post and Courier could find no examples. They reached out to, some people with the schools to see where these were coming from, and ultimately, it turns out that some of the things that were in the amended lawsuit, which included like quotes from books, and the quotes, if they were in these books that were being taught to children, could certainly potentially be violating state law. Well, the problem was they weren't actually being taught to students. However, in their minor defense, these books were available in the school library. That's a whole other issue. Obviously, we've seen those stories too, where people are trying to ban books or get certain topics removed from school libraries that people think are inappropriate for whatever age children are in those specific schools. That's a whole different thing. That's not what this lawsuit was alleging. It was alleging that students were purposefully being taught certain concepts. They weren't. These books were not assigned by any teachers. They were not part of any, discussion within the classroom themselves. Just like any other school in the country, there's a lot of books in libraries, none of which are actually taught to the students. They're just libraries that have books. So that's what they were alleging. They found some books in these libraries, found some quotes that were the most headline grabbing and eye popping, and claimed that students were being taught these concepts, and they weren't. So despite that, I'm sure these lawsuits are going to continue. And, the Freedom Caucus, again, to their credit, is very good with social media and riling up people, not just their base, but some people who also like kind of sort of agree with some of the things they say. And we're going to continue to see this if, more people like the Post and Courier don't step up and be like, hey, this is not at all what they're saying it is. Yes, the school, it may look like the school's admitting fault when they settle these lawsuits, but the details are really telling in that the schools don't admit any wrongdoing, they don't pay anything, and they were not found to be in violation of state law. Why? Because they weren't violating state law. But when people see a settled lawsuit, they assume that the party that's settling it is admitting fault, even though they weren't. So, great job by the Post and Courier to look into accusations that, were granted coming from the lawyer of the Freedom Caucus, but they looked into it to say, hey, if we got something wrong, we're going to look into it and we're going to make a correction. Well, it just made it worse for the Freedom Caucus in that the accusations weren't even accurately described and weren't being taught to children. But don't expect that to change their current methods and stop them from filing these nuisance lawsuits, because why would they? More people want to believe these things are wrong than actually look into it and realize, oh no, these are without merit and there's been absolutely no proof that the things they're alleging are happening. So don't expect this to stop anytime soon. A local organization called Tri-County Speaks has begun a bar outreach program. It actually began this past spring, but they're looking to get some more bars involved. This program is being done in partnership with MUSC and has had a handful of local bars jump onto the program so far, including places like Palmetto Brewing Company, Frothy Beard Brewing Company, and Edmonds Oast Brewing Company. The program offers training to local bars to help bartenders become the first line of defense against sexual assaults. This program teaches them how to spot and safely intervene in what could turn into a drug or alcohol facilitated sexual assault. So why is this in the news right now? Why is Tri-County Speaks kind of pushing this program right now? Well, it's because they claim that they typically see about 200 rape victims a year that they accompany to local hospitals, but they feel like over these last few months, they're actually taking what seems like a lot more victims than they normally do at this time of year. Obviously, cause for concern. So they're starting to push this program a little bit more, trying to get other bars to participate. Not only are there some in person options, they also have launched a virtual training option in the hopes of accommodating different schedules and more bartenders. Another reason they're pushing this out, not just because they're seeing higher than normal numbers right now, they also say that we're heading into what's been called the red zone. They say this is the time frame from the start of the fall semester for colleges through Thanksgiving break, which is when more than 50% of all college sexual assaults are likely to happen. So with that coming up, and what they say is a rise in incidents, they want to make sure this is out there. So the organization spoke with Live 5 News. You can see that link in our show notes for more details about the program and what some of the folks in the area that have been through the program are saying. And spoiler alert, they're saying good things because this is a program that they feel will help them be better community members, can help be better business owners, and helping out their patrons who may, find themselves in some trouble. Everything, this could potentially save someone's life on the very, very serious side of things, or prevent a rape or sexual assault. These very serious things could be prevented. In worst case, maybe it's just an uncomfortable situation, which could easily turn violent or bad in other aspects. So really no downside to any programs, restaurants rather, or bars participating in this program. So if you own a business or work for one, or are friends with somebody who thinks that, the business might want or be interested in taking this program, visit the link in the show notes and it'll give you details on how businesses can sign up to be part of what could be a life-changing program for some of their patrons. We haven't talked much about the Hollywood strike that's going on. It started out as a writer's strike. It didn't really seem to affect any of the productions here in Charleston, which is why I didn't bring it up. The handful of productions we know about either had wrapped up by this time, or in the case of Outer Banks, the Netflix show, they were filming, but the writing portion was done. So since it was a writer's strike, the rest of the industry was still going on. Now that's not the case. Some folks stopped working on productions in solidarity with the writers, prior to this past couple weeks, but there's been a big shift, and now it's affecting productions that were still going even though the writing process was done, and that includes Outer Banks. Filming was actually suspended this past week on that hit series as actors and production staff from across the industry joined the picket line in the ongoing writer's strike. Now, OBX, which is the abbreviation for the show, as well as the area of North Carolina that the show takes place in, is actually filmed here in the Charleston area, as I mentioned, and I'm sure many of you know, and also other parts around the Low Country. The show actually has been here since its first season, and the season that was just suspended was their fourth. So, for a little bit more background, the Hollywood writers actually initiated a strike back on May 3rd. They're fighting for a higher minimum pay as well as better residual payments from the streaming era. There's been a lot of talk about how the streaming services have really just upended the industry in many ways, but including the way writers and actors and other people involved in production are paid. And the more you look into it, the more you realize like how bad it is, this current system. There's also some concerns over the use of artificial intelligence because it can mimic the work that some of these people do, or even mimic the likenesses of some people in the industry. So they're worried about that, and thinking that production companies may try to implement more AI in productions, thus taking jobs away from real people. So after all that, it was a writer's strike, but yes, actors have now doubled down on those concerns. They have joined the picket lines. This happened when the SAG-AFTRA group, which is SAGFARTRA, hit the picket line this past Friday in a show of solidarity. At this point, from media reports, there does not appear to be any hope anytime soon that this strike is going to end. A deal does not seem like it's even remotely possible. Again, things can change quickly. Sometimes things look dire, but then once everybody's money starts getting affected, things change. But the sad part about all of this is the people that are really affected by this and the people who are losing out on money are the people who need it the most. When you think of Hollywood and writers and things like that, of course, you're thinking of the biggest names. You're thinking of your favorite actor, actress, producer, if you have one, director, the big names, super rich people. And you think, this is ridiculous. We've got a bunch of rich actors and directors arguing with a bunch of rich production studio heads. No, the real issue is the folks down the table a little bit. The writers that maybe have another job because they don't have consistent employment. They work on a show for a little bit and then they have to wait for something else of theirs to be picked up or to be hired onto a new show. The people behind the camera doing all the grunt work and that kind of stuff. Not the people you hear about making millions and millions of dollars. So try to keep that in mind when you see these things, because that's who's really being affected by this. And yeah, it stinks that some of your favorite shows or movies may be delayed or canceled outright. That sometimes happens in strikes. Studios, TV stations, whatever, just decide, you know what, because of the strike, we can't just keep holding on to the show. And when things get back to normal, we don't want to do it anymore for whatever reason. They cancel it. So you could see a lot of that coming up. And hopefully these two sides will come to an agreement. I know there's bigger things in the world, but entertainment, movies, television shows, these are things we talk about all the time and enjoy. And like I was talking about Blink 182 at the top of the show about how important that music was to me at a time in my life when I was with, my closest friends in high school and college and doing all the fun things that people that age do. The same could be said of these shows, and not just when you're young. You could have very fond memories of talking about shows with friends, or going online and discussing shows with strangers or movies with people you've never met online, or your closest friends even. So keep that in mind as you see these stories. It's not just about the people at the top making so much money. It's about all the people down the line that are not. So much more to talk about, but I've run out of time. I wax poetic too much about the good old days of my life that I went on way too long. But hopefully you didn't mind. I've got some big stories to talk about. The next episode is Wednesday. The best way to make sure you don't miss that episode is, of course, to subscribe to the podcast. Do so on whatever platform you're listening on right now. That way you don't miss the show, and therefore you're not up to date on the latest news here in the Charleston area and beyond. You don't want to be that person. You want to know what's going on. So be sure to subscribe. And as a little teaser, the stories I didn't get to, but will on Wednesday in subcapacity, involve some court cases, involve more than one fugitive from the law. We have some updates to get to, so be sure to come back here later this week. Subscribing also helps me get this podcast in other people's ears. If you've already subscribed, there's some other ways you can help. So if you could just take a few moments to do something like rate the podcast, review it. It doesn't have to be long. You can just do a couple sentences. If you do things like that, that helps this get out to more people as well. You can go that extra step if you so choose by going to holycitycenter.com/shop to pick up some merchandise, or going to patreon.com/holycitycenter, where you can sign up for one of those support tiers that will help make this podcast even better than it already is. No thanks to me, but to the production team at LMC Sound System, but also helps out the website and everything in Holy City Center land. So I really appreciate anybody who can and is able to do that. While I'm doing my thank yous, I also have to say a big one to Cole Collins of the aforementioned LMC Sound System, who produces each and every episode of this podcast and does an amazing job at it, as well as Tyler Boone, whose killer music you hear in each and every episode as well. And I can't say it enough, so thank you again for listening. I can't wait to talk to you guys on Wednesday. But until then, and as always, good night and good luck.